Hi everyone, welcome to our Q&A of Fabrizio Salvador, known around the world as a leading expert in operations management. He already helped companies such as DHL, IBM, Nokia and Unilever harness digital technologies, and today he will be answering your questions on creating digital transformation roadmaps. You can start typing your questions in the panel on the right-hand side, and we'll be sure to address them. Fabrizio, welcome.
Thank you.
So
my pleasure.
We'll have some questions lined up, but I don't know if you'd like to take a minute just to introduce the subject to those new to digital transformation roadmaps and give a very broad overview of your expertise in the area.
Okay, thank you so much, Carolina, and thank everyone for logging in and joining this interactive question and answer. So my name is Fabrizio Salvador. I am a faculty of Operational Technology at iBusiness School, which is one of the leading business schools in Europe. And I also have the position of Vice Rector for Applied Research here. And most relevant, when we talk about digitalization, in my case, I've always been working on digitalization since when the word was not there, because all my, let's say, career is about studying how companies can use digital technologies to improve operational excellence in their processes. And since I have been always using analytic approaches, it was just a serendipitous opportunity that more recently this became a topic of attention for most companies. Now, talking with the people from the leadership network, we were thinking about, hey, what would be an interesting topic for a Q&A, and it looks like that most companies nowadays are really thinking hard about digital transformation. What does it mean for them? What are the opportunities there? But also, how can you stage this change? So while you, let's say, think about or formalize your question, I would just briefly outline what I actually learned interacting with literally hundreds of higher level executives, especially in manufacturing, about this transformation. Many of them actually is people that I could met by through the master classes that we organize, but not only, of course. Now, what are the things? So when you think about the digital transformation, clearly is a tailored journey for every company, but it is also true that there are some common phases, if you want, that can be identified and are good for any type of company. And I normally refer to these phases as groundbreaking, experimenting, piloting, and scaling. So briefly, to just sketch out these phases, what do they mean? So groundbreaking, what is that? The fact is that oftentimes, if you read the business press, it looks like that everyone has a lot of data and data lakes on which to build an analytic application. But the truth is that a lot of operational processes don't have this data, or is incomplete, or has serious quality and integrity issues, or is simply not easily accessible because it's distributed. So the first stage in this journey is actually to create systems that collect and feed these data lakes. And the idea of this first initiative, therefore, is really how can I assemble sufficient data? And while for certain rich companies this is sufficient to start let's say the investment, for many other companies it requires a different justification. And the justification is really that you improve visibility of your operations, but you get an indirect benefit. You get these data lakes that provide you information about decisions that are made every day by people and teams and units, and the outcome of these decisions. At this point, you say, okay, we are done. We have visibility. So this is digital. Not really, because digital is really using this data to support decision making. So the real difficult leap comes here. Okay, I have a lot of good data about my process. How can I use to improve the work of people? And this is the phase of experimenting, where you're not yet ready to make a business case and start the pilot, but you want to understand whether there is something there, and how difficult it is to create the real final target data set structure that you need for analysis, and how this solution would sit in your organization, how people would actually use this abstract entity that we call an algorithm. And the idea of experimentation is that it should be faster, low cost, low risk. And once you're done with that, you get into the third phase. What is that? That is pilots. So pilot is different from experiments. Experiments are about learning, checking whether I can do something, what is the potential. Pilots are about proving impact on business KPIs. And this is no wonder, but it has a lot of tricky points that we can discuss during the rest of the Q&A. Finally, pilots tend to be local initiatives or central initiatives, but that is not scaled solutions. Scaled solutions mean that the digital solution, the algorithm, there's some decision rule that people use for setting up equipment, for controlling quality, for scheduling, for date promising, for whatever you may think about, are available to all the sites who may need them. So they are scaled across the organization, and therefore they can impact real business yardsticks. And here, few companies are really fully doing the scalability part of the game. There is a lot of different ways to think about it, and this is also possible area for discussion. So given this introduction, I would just go to the question. And Carolina, where do we start here?
Thank you very much for that intro, very useful. The first question is, how firms need to reorganize internally to be successful in the digital economy?
Okay, this is actually a good question. It's a big question. How should you get organized internally to be successful in the digital economy in this transition? So the fact is that if you really look at the best in class, digitalization is not just about technology, and it requires a deep change within an organization. And there are at least 4 areas of the organization that need to change. First of all, let's remember, what is the goal? The goal is to create algorithms or data rules or decision support systems that help people making better decisions, right? How do I staff a maintenance team? Why send there? How do I diagnose a problem? How do you know when a machine will need a sort of replacement? Many things. Or how broad should be the level of cross-training of an employee in the shop floor, right? So all these questions require, above all, a new mission for IT. So the new mission for IT, on top of what they always had, is the creation, maintenance, and ease of access to data lakes. So that is to say, IT needs to have a new skills that are sort of data engineering skills, if you want, that are meant to accumulate this precious data about operational decisions and the outcome of this decision that can be later fed to those who will develop these new algorithms. And here comes the second new, let's say, if you're a new function or new team that you need to have, which is what we could call the analytics development team in the company. So this is a team of people that have the, let's say, the goal of creating new algorithms. And these teams are cross-functional because you need, yes, data scientists, but you need also process specialists, because the data scientist alone will not take you very far. And you maybe need some lead users there to get a sense of whether it makes sense, the type of algorithms and the use of the data that you're making. You may need also some data engineer there, and you have to think about where this team are. It could be totally local, they could be local with some central expert, they could be across different plants, they could be partially internal, partially external. So there are a lot of design decisions that may be taken there. The problem is that many people at this point forget another fundamental type of thing, because creating an algorithm doesn't mean improving your KPIs. For doing that, the algorithm has to be embedded into the systems people use in their everyday work, right? So if I want to create an algorithm that tells to a maintenance operator how much time does he or she have to fix a machine before you incur OEE losses, for example, well, where do I put the algorithm? How does the person know this? So you have to interface it with the systems. And these require process engineers, man-machine interface experts, very important involvement with the users, and also, again, it requires IT, because you have to wire this back to the infrastructure of the plant. So what is important in this team that I call algorithm deployment team is very different from the algorithm development team, because the development team is the crazy data science innovative people that create these algorithms, right? They're basically sort of intellectually engaged people that have fun in dealing with complex problems. But when you think about staffing the deployment team, this is people that have totally different ambition, interest, and they kick for different things. It's people who like to see stuff running. They don't like to create algorithms. They like to see that people are using something and doing something better. And this is another fundamental part of the organization that needs to be updated and changed for these analytics. And finally, the fourth part of the organization that needs updated is management, because all the people who govern at different levels within the corporation, this change, are high level or middle level, even low level managers, and they have to learn new skills, new way of organizing, and they also have to be part of this cultural transformation to have the faith in the power of this solution. So to sum up, 4 different things. In IT, data engineers, data lake engineers. In development, analytic development team, create the algorithm. In deployment, there are algorithm deployment teams that make this algorithm available throughout the shop floor, offices, wherever. Finally, management at different levels. These are the 4 main organizational changes that happen when you want to, let's say, transition towards this new game of the digital economy in manufacturing.
Thank you very much. A very comprehensive answer. Another question, slightly on the same note, is what is the recommended path for a factory to transition to a smart factory? How do you define what goes first?
Okay, this is really about prioritization. Is another very important question. Thank you for making it, whoever made it. And many times when I talk to managers, they mention the problem of prioritization. So yeah, many ideas, let's do this, let's do that. How can we prioritize these, let's say, improvement initiative geared towards digital? I would say that the first thing to keep in mind is where your problems are. So don't be fooled by the technology. I know that sometimes we get very enthusiastic for these technologies, but in the end of the day, technologies exist to serve a purpose. And so the real starting point is, where are your pain points? Where do you think are the important area for improvement or to create a new digital business? And there you think about, you begin thinking about prioritization. And at this point, the first question is, okay, where do I have data, right? So if I want to, let's say, create new decision-based model that are fed by data, so what data are you talking about? And do you have data to check whether this model could work, first of all? A third thing that you want to consider when prioritizing, a third criterion is where are the low-hanging fruits? Because you may have data for a certain algorithm, but actually the algorithm is pretty complicated to develop and to have a strong predictive power. And in other cases, you may have a less good data, but it's easy actually to build a rough can-do solution. So that is also something that they want to consider. And fourth thing in prioritization is really scalability. So scalability of an algorithm starts with the scalability of the problem. Are we talking about a problem that is specific of a plant? And maybe you have the great data, is a problem for the plant, and is a low-hanging fruit, greater, but is not scalable. So same characteristic with another problem that is common to other plants or facilities, probably you want to prioritize it, right? So in the end of the day, this thing, pain points, opportunities. 2 is, as I was saying, the availability of data. 3 is low-hanging fruit, and 4 is scalability. I would say that, I mean, this is not, of course, law of physics, but 4 important things that you need to consider when you want to define priorities for digital initiatives. Hope I'm addressing the question.
Thank you. Just to remind those who just joined us, I saw, please make sure that you put your questions on the right-hand side in the panel. The question number 3 here is how to prepare your people for this change.
This is also a very important question that we need to consider, right? People. A lot of time we really think hard about people and how we can prepare them for this change. I would say that first of all, we need to understand that this takes patience and is a process that needs some degree of graduality, right? And in this sense, therefore, if you think about the first phase of change that I mentioned before, when we talk about groundbreaking, let's say creating data lakes, what I noticed in many cases is that when you move from a non-digitalized process to a digital one, so you just start to collect data, have visibility tools, and you start to store this data, people begin to make a connection and they begin to think as data as an asset, right? Imagine that I do a simple process tracking with tablets based on a wireless system that goes on the web, as I saw in many plants. So when you start to do this, and the plant before has maybe a paper and pencil tracking of line problems, they start seeing that, hey, we have all this data now about which products had problems in which shifts, from which customers, served by which workers. So the first thing happens, people start thinking about this data per se as an asset. It's not only about the equipment or just seeing what is going on. The second thing that allow you to prepare people is people believe something when they see some effect of it, right? So in this sense, before jumping to pilots, which can be sometimes risky and perhaps disappointing, so they can become a sort of boomerang in terms of creation of a digital culture. When you instead go for short-term experiments that are meant to prove that, hey, you know what? You thought I couldn't predict the time it takes up to maintain a machine, but now, based on the characteristics of the people that I send there, the characteristics of the failure and the characteristics of the machine, I can predict it, and therefore I can better schedule machine serving resources. And when people see that, okay, they believe to touch it. They see. I saw this, for example, in software maintenance, where we could demonstrate that an algorithm was better than the planner 82% of the times in forecasting the time it took to the company to fix a bug on the ERP. When people see that, okay, something begins to happen in their mind. And then, of course, also pilots are important later to show people to make this transition, because they not only see that, okay, theoretically on paper this algorithm works, they see the impact on the real life of the plant, on hard performance metrics, and so they gain trust in the solution. And finally, when you scale, if you are able to scale a solution, the message that you send to people is very strong, because you are basically saying that this is the way we are going to do business. We are scaling this. This becomes the new standard. And so this also creates a new kind of mindset. Above all, however, what I noticed in other plants, for example, we learned from big automotive manufacturers in Germany playing with digitalization on the assembly line, is that sometimes we underestimate what our workers know about digital. So the point is really try to learn more about your people. For example, at Audi, while setting up the digital assembly infrastructure in their plant, they discovered that people were sort of line support engineers. In their free time, they could program in Python or HTML interfaces or other digital technologies. Nobody asked them. right? So we don't assume that, hey, I have a workforce that is not able to do anything. Well, depends on which workforce, which generation they are, and maybe if you ask them, you will discover a few surprises. And the final thing that you have to consider, and this goes back to the first question that I was asked, is about the specificity of preparing people for this change. If you remember what I said at the beginning, for those who could join later, I said there are 4 parts of the organization that are affected by digitalization. IT, because they become the guardians, developers, and access gatekeepers of data lakes. You have the people that develop algorithms, which is not only data scientists, and then you have the people who deploy algorithms, which make sure that these algorithms are available on the shop floor, in the offices, in the supply chain for everyday use by people, and management, who make sure that all the analytic loop is working, running, and improves performance. So when you think about how do you prepare people for the change, we have to ask ourselves, which people? How do I prepare IT people? How do I prepare analytic development team? How do I prepare analytic deployment teams? And how do I prepare management, right? So the question of preparing talent must also be split based on the different functions that are affected by this change, by this transition. Hope I addressed the question.
Thank you. Another question we just received is, how do we distinguish between a digital roadmap versus a technology roadmap? How do we define digital versus technology implementation? For example, an ERP implementation, a digital initiative, or an ERP on the cloud is a digital initiative? If yes, why? If no, why?
Well, if I understand, I focus on the beginning of the question. I say a digital, let's say, a transformation roadmap versus a technology roadmap, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think that this is a good question too, because sometimes we focus too much on technology, right? And of course, when you think about technology, you are thinking, okay, I'm using a RAMI standard for defining data structures across different plants or different machines, and I want to use a certain type of solution. I want to send this on the cloud. I want to keep this local. I have this connectivity bus that I'm going to use in the plant. And I will use this vendor rather than the other vendor. And this is all fundamentally very important. But if you think in terms of organizing the transition, we have to go back to the basics. What does it mean? The digital transformation is a strategic change in organization. And changing an organization, when you change its strategy, means changing 4 things. 1, structure. 2 is about processing systems. 3 is about incentive and rewards. 4 is about people and culture. Now, when we talk about technology, we are just talking about systems, right? And if you want processes, because when you change system, you start to change processes. But then when you think about governing the transition, what about structure? Structure is where you put responsibilities. And one of the fundamental decisions here is how do you divide responsibility from the digital, let's say, unit in the headquarters or in some hub of competence that you may have, and what you leave to the plants. And I think that the message of Lean remains valid, of Lean Six Sigma remains valid. A lot of probably good initiatives about what to do with data should come from the base of the pyramid. So a constant question that you have to think through all the stages of the transformation, groundbreaking, experimenting, piloting, and scaling, is how you divide the role between what does headquarters do, what the plant do, then process, okay, how they interact in this. And if I want to have, I can have vertical interaction, but I have interaction across plants. So imagine, for example, that I have 2 plants that have a similar problem. How do they share information? So I have 1 plant, and only in the initial phase they just work on, but I allow other related plant to join or they work together with the other plants, right? These are all solutions, all things that you have to consider, right? And again, in terms of the process, depends on the problem that you have. Imagine I have a company with many packaging units, and I develop centrally an artificial intelligence technology for quality control on the packaging. Really, a carton box is similar across many packaging lines. So in this case, when you think about governance, okay, you want to centralize it a lot, but you may have other situations where plants are more idiosyncratic. And in this case, the more the plants are different from each other, if you can standardize everything, but it's a huge job, then you have to think of, okay, in my strategy, you have to think about scalability in a different way. It's not really about copying the algorithm for plant A and adopting in plant B. Is more about formalizing how a plant A went about a problem so that plant B can go about the problem themselves. And then also incentives, right? Think about it. So if you want to have a scalable solutions, that means that if, let's say, plant A develops a solution that is also usable by plant B, you know that the more usable, the more versatile solution, the more difficult it is to develop it, right? So what is that incentive for plant A management to develop something that other plants can use? So that would mean that when I put the KPI for this project, I will later put adoption at, let's say, 1 year after, 18 months after by other plants. So that is when we think about road mapping in terms of organization, there is much more than technology, because you have to think about all these aspects. As I said, structure, processes, incentives, and people.
Thank you.
Hopefully this highlights the difference.
Thank you. Another question from this was how to combine organic lean with top-down digitalization initiatives.
Well, this is another interesting question that comes up very often in discussions in class when we have the master class, and the link, right, between organizations that are deeply advanced and have Lean or Lean Six Sigma deeply ingrained within their let's say, working routines and their operations, and how does digital fit in? In my experience and what I saw, they are highly compatible because, let's say, first of all, in which sense are similar and in which sense there are differences. Are similar because if you think the improvement routines, the define, measure, improve, analyze, control cycles of Lean Six Sigma, they can be perfectly executed using data. So here, the routine is the same. You know that black belts actually have statistical training. So beefing up a little bit the training of black belts and green belts, you can easily make the jump, or at least these people can interact with more professional and sophisticated statisticians. And we are used to do this sort of experiment and then go at the level of control. So implement them stably within your organization. So in this sense, it's good. What are the differences? Well, I mean, if you really stick to the mantra of Lean Six Sigma, improvement initiatives start from ideas that are generated by workers. And in this case, workers may have problems, but sort of some of the intuition of the solution actually come through data analysis, especially when you use machine learning or neural networks. They can actually come up with things that people didn't think. For example, in the chemical industry, there are cases where there is an abnormal productivity of a reactor. They run neural network data on the process parameter data set, and they find new ways to understand the chemistry of the reaction that before they didn't have. So this stuff happens. And what is a big something that companies are doing well that is different from what was done in the past with Lean. So Lean was very, very much bottom up, to the extent that sometimes it was difficult to prove a global impact of Lean across the organization, because scalability was something that not totally clear. With digital, companies are, yes, creating infrastructure in their low-level operations, in the plants, in the offices, in the factories, but they also have a central digital unit. And so the importance of this digital unit is to govern this change, ensuring greater scalability. So in this sense, with the digital, also because we are talking about data and algorithms, we have a greater oversight of what happens across the company, and therefore a greater potential for making a really sizable impact on business KPIs. That's my view.
Thank you. Another question here is, how do you manage the daily workload with reinventing the business at the same time?
That is an evergreen, right, of improvement, because normally companies after the crisis have been slashing down staff, reducing to the bare bottom headcount in many areas. And really, people are already running at more than 100% capacity. So the question is, how do you free resources? So here I have two answers. And one is actually a little bit, because it's true that we are all, let's say, super busy and let's say stretched by too many goals and things. But it's also true that companies are putting real money, creating digital directions, to creating budget for digital innovation. And not all companies, but many are. So it's not always true that you do not have resources. So the question is really to decide what you set these people up to do. And there is where people may get stuck, because, okay, I may have the resources, or I may, let's say, make a point for that, but how do I make a case for the resources? And here comes the second part of my answer. When you think about doing digital initiatives as pilots, that is very demanding, because you are really changing something, let's say, in a production line or in a maintenance department, actually in your real operations. You are making the change to see what happens. And this takes significant time. And it's not always easy to do, especially when you don't know whether this is going to be really beneficial. So my point here is that the experiment stage is really important, because with experiments, the idea is that you engage in small efforts that last maximum a few weeks or very few months with very small people, and typically you can leverage external resources to see whether something is possible. Is it true that by exploiting those data, I can improve OEE of this equipment? And since I come, I have one foot in the world of academia, I can tell you that many universities are open now and very interested in collaborating with the factories and with large corporations at this stage, not at the consulting stage, but the experimental stage. What can I do there? So the idea is also maybe to give a practical recommendation, partner with an institution that is like an engineering school or something related to empirical research in production, and use these external resources to get a first sense of the possible benefit that you have. And then use this to make a case to ask for more resources if this is the case, or to grant access to available resources if the problem is getting an approval. That is my take here.
Thank you. A follow-up question is, how do we measure success of a digital transformation journey? How do we ensure it is sustainable, not a one-time exercise?
Okay, that is also a very good question. Again, this links to the sort of a transition model that I sketched out at the beginning. If you remember, phase one, groundbreaking, create data lakes. Phase two, experiments, get to know what works, what is potential for certain digital solution. Phase three, piloting, seeing what happens when you really put the solution on the shop floor or in an office. And fifth, scaling. So when you talk about measuring the success of a digital transformation initiative, if you measure it only at the end of the journey, you will never get there. So you have to slice key performance indicators. So for the first stage, okay, what possible performance indicators is degree of speed of accumulation of the data that you care about, data quality, ease of data access, data integrity, safety, typical data engineering metrics if you want, but with an eye on how we're going to use them later. In phase 2 pilots, the benefit that the KPIs here is really where I have potential for improvement and how much. Maybe you thought that you could predict the failure of that equipment, but after doing a few pilots, you say that this is much more complicated than you expected. So at this point, maybe it's bad news, but what you learn is that, okay, I better focus on something else. And when you find something that works, well, you know that on paper, based on what comes out with simulation with this database algorithm, we could increase our machine availability by 12%, right? So what are the KPIs in the second stage is really what can work and what can't, and for things that can work, how much, what will the potential benefit. Phase 3 in pilots is really about all the problems are in the details, really understanding where are the organizational, let's say, tweaks that may that become critical to ensure the success in the implementation of this algorithm, and also to give a real number, because one thing is that theoretically I can improve online effectiveness by 12%, but then you have to see what happened in the plant and why that is maybe lower or maybe even higher. So again, in this stage, we're measuring really KPIs. And in stage 4, we are really measuring two things: overall KPI for the company, but also we are measuring adoption. And you can even become creative there, but I don't want to complicate it too much at this point. The message, therefore, is that when you stage the change, for each stage, you need to define these different KPIs.
Thank you. There was also a question here on the platforms for IT that you would actually recommend to support your digital transformation, and what is the recommended data strategy?
Well, platform for IT, first of all, let me clarify that I am not a technologist. I work in a business school, so I can tell you my answer from a business perspective, even though by training I'm an industrial engineer. So here, IT platform, the fundamental thing is, if I want to have a platform that allow, for example, to share data across plants, you really have to understand what is the level of homogeneity between your plants. Because if I have plants that have, let's say, the same type of equipment or equipment of the same generation from the same vendors or equivalent vendors, then they would naturally create similar data. So at this point, okay, the question really becomes, it's kind of interesting, becomes what shall I save all this data, or I should save a subset of it? And it's a real question, because a lot of my industrial equipment, for example, creates an amount of data that if you save everything on the cloud, it would be just too costly. So that's why you need somehow to do experiments to understand which data is really needed and with which frequency. And then based on that, you define what will be the overall data lake requirement, right? In other case, I saw organization where they were thinking about problem in a different way. And the idea of management was, I want all plants to have a minimum subset of common data so that each plant can experiment with this data, trying to tweak it to fix their own specific equipment, even if they have different equipment. So in this case, therefore, the question is there a common subset of data that can be shared, even though equipment are kind of different? And other ways, if the plants are very, very heterogeneous with each other, then you really to question how much broadband you need in this platform. Maybe they become just a tool for central control, and therefore probably you already have some setup there. But when you get into the detail, that becomes a real engineering problem. The sky and data security problem, because you have all the issue about how to ensure that this data is secure, cannot be pirated, and all this kind of stuff that becomes really technological.
Thank you. The last question is, could you share any failures you've seen in implementing digital strategy and the lessons learned?
Okay, well, it's always sexy to talk about failures, and sure, well, probably would be nice to have a more interactive, let's say, conversation with you guys at this point, but typical failures that I see, one is not specific of digital, the way we call it today, is a failure that companies do very often when they use information technology in an attempt to improve, and is calling the vendors too early. Because you're calling the vendors or large consulting corporations too early when you didn't define what you think is the way this digital solution add value to your processes. The risk is that they will just sell you what they have. And since you didn't do the homework before, you may fail and commit to buy resources and technology that you do not necessarily need that much. So again, to avoid this failure, the experimenting phase is important, because one fundamental output of experiments is to build a picture of what you want the technology to do for you. And that picture must go into the specifications of the contract with the vendors. And another error that I saw happening is staffing of the analytics team. Sometimes people are put in this team without really checking, internal people, without really checking their passion and interest into analytics. And if you do this type of error, these people are thinking about their next career move. And this is very bad news for you, because you fail to capitalize on a past experience on digitalization. So it is really important when you create these teams to make sure that you have true believers there that are eager to do that. And the second important thing is, did you think about a career path for people that are on the analytics part of digitalization? So if they stay there, are they doomed to stay in an office in a peripheric plant, or there is a career progression that is clearly outlined in front of them? And a third error that happens sometimes is also avoid the not invented here syndrome and try to create your own roadmap and plan just looking at your belly. It's always good to benchmark and get inspired by others, and that's why we have the masterclass here. That sounds like advertising, but it's not, because something that we do a lot in the masterclass is really to see what each other are doing. And while people hear about others' company specific decision and organizational setups, they get ideas, or at least they can contrast what they're doing with someone else to avoid getting sort of tunnel vision where you get stuck into a specific initial decision. Okay, hope I addressed this question too.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for your time and your insight, and thank you to everyone joining. You will receive a follow-up email with a link in case you're interested in hearing more about Fabrizio's masterclass called Leading the Factory of the Future. Hope everyone has a great day, and I'm sure we'll be seeing each other soon.
Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.